Alrighty, guys. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope we've got a good crowd today. Oh, y'all hold tight. I knew this would happen. Mr. Bob is joining us. Mr. Bob, we are live right now. Can you hear me? Oh, we're having audio issues with Mr. Bob again. Um, anyways, we'll be fixing this. Y'all
Okay.
bear with us.
I can see you guys, but I'm not hearing.
All
Okay.
right, we can hear
Um,
you.
we'll have to work on that. Today, as you can tell, we've got Mr. Bob Dumont and Mr. Steve Moore. And those of y'all that follow any of my social media accounts should know the name Stephen Moore, because anytime I get a chance or anyone asks about SOG books, I instantly bring up this book. It's all over my Twitter, my Instagram, and all of that. It is my personal favorite. It is an outright overall history of FOB2, CCC, and then pretty much up to the Task Force 2 advisory element, and then the shutdown to where it's pretty much just the strategic directorate and I think the special mission group. And he is actually working on, or is finished, and the Bob Howard biography is linked in the show notes. Go ahead, pre-order that. I've pre-ordered it. Looks like it's going to be amazing. We'll get to hear about that today. And Mr. Bob Dumont, who is joining us, hopefully we'll get his audio working. He worked with Mr. Joe Parnar on SOG Medic. This is the original. Those of y'all probably have the blue hardcover that's a little bit smaller and a little bit thicker. And Mr. Bob worked with a non-SOG A-team vet, Mr. Jerry Krizan, who actually was in medic class with Joe Parnar and several other SOG vets. And he wrote an interesting book and worked with him writing a book called BIOGRAPHY, a Green Beret Medic's War in Vietnam. And BIOGRAPHY, as you know, is Vietnamese for doctor. It's an absolutely great look at really a hot zone in Vietnam for an A-team guy. So I can't recommend all of these books enough if you're looking for any SOG history, especially FOB2 and CCC. But before I run it down the drain and talk us all to death here, let me hand it off to our first guest tonight, Mr. Steve. Mr. Steve's going to talk to us a little bit. He's going to introduce himself, and we're going to see if we can get Mr. Bob involved here. So, Mr. Steve, the floor is yours, sir.
All right, Bud. Appreciate you having me here, and Bob can probably chime in here shortly. We kind of worked together on a couple things when I got to working on these books. I've done a lot of Texas history and World War II history, but long story short, my uncle-in-law, George Wilson Hunt, we know him as Wilson because there's all kind of George Hunts in the family. The Army guys know him as George. He was in MACV-SOG, Special Forces, and we heard little bits and pieces of these stories at the family reunions. And he couldn't tell a whole lot, or he's kind of humble. He didn't like to brag. But he said, yeah, we kind of did our job. We did this and that. And he'd talk about being inserted with a small team into enemy territory. Sometimes you got NVA trackers on you immediately. You've got dogs. You're being pulled out on strings on helicopters. And I'm thinking, what kind of crazy is this that you're saying it was no big deal? And then, again, long story short, I said, Wilson, one of these days we're going to sit down. I want to hear all these stories and we're going to write this up. And he kind of hinted that it was a little bit classified, couldn't say a whole lot. But then after John Plaster's book came out, the original SOG book, his name was in there, George Hunt. And I'm like, wow, you're in this book. I mean, you guys did some stuff talking about a prisoner snatch mission and things like that. And a number of years later, we did sit down and start on it. And he started telling me the stories. I started recording it. But he said, if you really want to learn what we did, you need to come to SOAR. You need to come to Vegas to the reunion and talk to the guys I ran with, the other guys from the base, the helicopter pilots, the SPAD pilots. And so I did. I ended up going there a couple of times and interviewed, I think, somewhere around 100 different people by the time that book was ready to go to press. And it became a lot more than Wilson Hunt's story. It became 5 Medal of Honor guys from his base, and pretty much a long period from the start of FOB2 till about the time of the Doug Miller Medal of Honor mission, and it kind of wraps up quickly after that. But obviously, a lot of guys ran missions after that. I just kind of had to finally bring it to an end, but it was an honor to meet these guys and to have them share their stories for sure, Bud.
I can only imagine what your first, much like all of ours, like you said, when you first hear about what the guys were doing, it's almost like I've never heard anything about this. I mean, I've heard about special forces working with Indig and all of that, but this is crazy. Um, and then I had the chance, luckily, to attend SOAR in 2022, and that's going into a whole different world. I can only imagine what it's like, you going, being a family member related to Mr. Hunt, and kind of having that already being vouched for, shall we say, your family, so they kind of know you're good people. So I can only imagine the stories and the stuff you heard that first visit.
Yeah, it's a family for sure there, and I'm an outsider. I had no part in this. You know, I was a young kid when Vietnam was going on. Um, but once you sit down with Wilson and he starts introducing you to fellow 1-0s and talking about, your interest in that and learning about it, then once they figure you're okay, so to speak, the stories start flowing, and then we get deeper into different missions. And I talked to as many people as I could at the reunions and did a lot of follow-up calls, and even went to the 57th Assault Helicopter Group's reunion when they had it in Texas. Interviewed Rick Griffin and the guys that were on the Zabatowski mission, and I was learning. I was learning every person I spoke with, and I'm indebted to them because I learned a lot and did the best I could to help honor some of these guys that didn't come back home to get a lot of honor in the late 60s, early 70s, frankly.
It's really, and guys, this is Mr. Hunt right here, training with RT Main, or it may have been actually ST Main still at the time, getting ready for a static line insert. This is at Longton getting ready, but I'm glad to see, even amongst my group, the 30-year-olds, but even the younger kids, it seems like the Vietnam vets are finally starting to get not only the recognition from the younger group, but admiration. I mean, everyone knows Tilt, knows Dick Thompson. I mean, they're literally becoming household names, and it's that feeling that I'm glad it's finally happened. But this easily should have happened years and years and years ago, because it came out. I mean, it was in the 90s. I mean, this should have happened long ago. But with your writing and Mr. Bob's work with Mr. Joe, this is how it's occurring. You're making it
Yeah,
happen.
and you mentioned Dick Thompson. I just read his first book, and I've got his second book on order. And first one was fascinating, great tales. Can't wait to read the second one. And some of these other guys that have been telling their stories, they're long overdue. But it's kind of sad because even some of the guys I talked to less than 10 years ago, a number of them aren't with us, like Joe Walker and some of the famous 1-0s. Gene
That,
McCarley.
that's really the sad thing. We're getting some hot audio here. I apologize about that, guys. That's one thing about. I'll give Jason Hardy a plug, guys. You all know how much I enjoy Jason Hardy's books and how much he helps the community, and he's a godsend to the community. Just flat out. But going through here, some of the guys that we had that he actually knows, if they've passed away, it's really sad seeing some of the big names and how early they died. We're getting 80s, early 90s, and it's really sad that those men didn't get to share their stories, because, as we know, as you said earlier, the 80s, it was still classified, and if they'd have shared, it would have been against the law. So their story died with them, unfortunately.
Yeah, Jason Hardy, I mean, he's a true hero. He's a trooper putting these stories out there. He has helped me countless times. Steve Sherman, lots of other people, Tiltmeyer, all these guys. Once they kind of figure out have good intentions on what you're trying to do, you're not out just to make a buck.
Mhm.
You're trying to tell some stories that need to be told. Jason and Steve and those guys always pitch in and try to help you get connected to some of these SOG veterans.
That they do, and to kind of since we've got Jason here, Mr. Bob, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. Would you
Oh,
like to would you like to
I
jump in
can't hear
here?
myself.
Would you like to jump in here now and maybe give a little excuse me, a little brief bio on yourself and kind of speak about how you got involved and how you met Mr. Joe, since we're speaking about Jason Hardy?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was through my brother-in-law, Wilson Hunt, George Hunt, and Steve has his version of events. But it started, I don't know, 2003 or four. He asked me to locate the family of a guy he had served with in Vietnam. And he didn't know much about him except he knew his name and he knew he was from New York. And I still live in New York. And at the time I worked at the New York Public Library, and he thought maybe I would be able to do some research and find family members because he'd taken photos. They'd taken photos of each other while they were on a mission. And he said the thing was the guy was killed about 2 or 3 weeks after we took these photos, and then he got a posthumous Medal of Honor, and his last name was Kettenberg, and that's about all the information he had. So when I got back to New York and was using the library, looking in the New York Times, had a big fat printed index, and anyway, I was able to track down a Kettenberg and read an account of the funeral. There was a funeral. He was from Brooklyn originally, but he grew up on Long Island, and the funeral was on Long Island. So the local newspaper there's Newsday had an account just of the funeral and talked a little bit about. I guess he hadn't even been nominated for the Medal of Honor at that point because the account was just a few weeks after he died. But there was a list of people who were attending the funeral, and one of them was an aunt whose name was Mary Jane Kettenberg. So had the Nassau County phone directories at hand, paper phone directories in those days. Found a phone number for her. So my original mission assignment was to find information about the family so he could have the slide. There were slides they had taken in the field printed up and he could send to the family. So I called this woman, Mary Jane Kettenberg, out of the blue, explained who I was. I didn't know what I was going to say, but explained who I was and who my brother-in-law was and that he had known her nephew. So she said, oh, yeah, we'd love to have photos because obviously they're the last photos ever taken of him. So I told Wilson, my brother-in-law, I said, okay, here's the person who the aunt of the guy you were with, here's her address, get the photos printed up and, send them to her. So, and then that was it as far as I was initially concerned, so, but he never got around to sending the photos for quite a while. So I'd call and my sister would say, Wilson, did you send those photos to that woman? And he'd say, well, no, not yet. Anyway, I talked to him. He said, I want to send the photos. I want to write a letter, but I just don't know what to say. I don't know how to present myself or, he just, just didn't know what to do. So I said, well, okay, send the photos to me. I've already talked to her on the phone. So send the photos to me, then I'll see that she gets the photos. And then there was also a sister, Kettenberg had a sister who lived in California. And I said, I'll see that they get the photos. So that's what I did. I sent them to Aunt Mary Jane. So happened I was going to be in California not too long after that. So I got in touch with the sister. She lived in Southern California. So I was going to be out there with some friends going to ball games and stuff. And I said, I could send you the photos. And she said, well, you can bring them, you can bring them to me since you'll be right and passing from San Diego going to LA. So she says, I live in, Orange County. So anyway, so I got the photos to her and talked to her and, kind of talked about this and that. She was a year or two older than John. And so she kind of gave me the whole background on, when they grew up in New York. And So that was my initial contact with the family. Got more interested in about the whole Kettenberg story. So talking to my brother-in-law about SOG. I'd never heard of SOG. I didn't know what SOG was or what he had done. So he, I guess he was still keeping the secret, but he told me a little bit about it, and so I said, "Oh wow, this is quite interesting, very interesting." So I tried to find out more about it. I heard about John Plaster's book, first SOG book, so I got a hold of that and read it. And George Hunt's actually mentioned in that book. You probably saw that, Steve, right? Where
Yes.
Wilson said he walked into a bookstore one day and saw SOG, a big stack of books that said SOG, and he says, "Whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? You can't talk about this." Looked in the index, found his name. So anyway, there was sort of an account of that mission he was on with Ed Lassane. And anyway,
a good one.
I just got more interested and asked him more questions about it, read more about it, and it kind of went from there. So,
wow, that's I mean, both of you, I mean, y'all really, I mean, jumping in with both feet and getting real close, real quick. I mean, helping
I didn't know anything
out.
about Steve. Yeah, I didn't know anything about Steve at that time. Wilson had told me, he says, "I have a nephew who writes books about military stuff," and that's all I knew at the time. So
I think you were out there at the first SOAR that I went to with Wilson, and or at least one
Oh,
of the
yeah,
ones
yeah,
I
yeah.
went to. And
Yeah, yeah.
we just spent
I had no
hour upon
clue
hour
what
with people.
Yeah. I got talking to Wilson more about it, and he was he was still didn't want to jump in on it. Some people heard about the photographs. Brian Laux wanted to use them for a veterans museum, and Frank Greco. I wrote a letter to Frank Greco, and then we started emailing, and I told him about the photos. He wanted to use them for his second SOG book, and so I presented this to Wilson, and he was very put off. He said, "I don't know, no." He says, "I just wanted to get the photos to the family. I don't know who Frank Greco is. I don't know, who Brian Laux is. I don't, So I kind of had to coax him on that a little bit, and
he takes a little work to get the stories out of him.
Yeah. I had a copy of Running Recon. I took it with me to Oklahoma.
Great.
And I showed him. I said, "Well, he'd seen Plaster's first book." I said, "Well, here's this guy, Frank Greco, that I've been in touch with." I said, "He's a really great guy, really interesting, really nice guy. And here's his book." So I remember he took a long time looking at the book. And anyway, I guess he got a little more at ease. And I said, Brian Laux wanted to use it for the Veterans Museum. So I had to draft an agreement between Wilson Hunt and Brian Laux, exclusive use of the photos, but only for the museum, up in Chehalis, Washington. So anyway, Wilson, he got kind of more at ease with stuff. And
I imagine that when he was looking at the Running Recon that you had given him, the reason it took so long, in my guesstimation, if you will, he was probably reading and seeing who was telling what, how far, how much had gotten out, to see how much he was willing to open up, if you will.
Yeah. And he and Joe were there at FOB2 at the same time, but they didn't know each other. But when I got to know Joe a little later, I was hearing the same stories from separately from Wilson and from Joe, like the Pappy Webb and the shooting the parrot story, famous story, So anyway, I kind of got more into the books. I wrote, as I say, I was in touch with Frank Greco, and he invited me to come to. He told me about SOAR. I didn't know what SOAR was or anything. So he invited me to come out there in 2005 or something like that. I said, "Yeah, sure." Then when I was going out there, I'm thinking, "I don't know about this. I don't know how this is going to go." And so Frank had said, "You'll get there a little before me, so go on in." And they let me come in. He said, "There's a guy named Jason Hardy who's sells paraphernalia and books and stuff." He said, "Go introduce yourself to him." So I did. I had these maps, Kettenberg maps and information. I mean, that was kind of my entree in this whole thing. So, introduced myself to Jason. Jason was busy, you know, like he is wheeling and dealing and
holding court,
selling, holding forth. And he said, "Why?" He said, Kettenberg. He says, "So see that guy standing over there, and there's a guy about 20 feet away." He says, "That's Joe Parner. Go talk to him." So I said, "Oh, yeah, I know who Joe Parner is. I've read about him in the books." So went up, introduced myself, and Joe just said, "Oh, yeah, let me see what you got." And we started talking, and we just talked for hours. Went into the evening just talking about this and that. So over the course of the SOAR, Frank was still selling Running Recon at the time. So he was selling his books. He had a vendor's desk. And so he said right toward the end, he and Joe left early. They didn't stay for the banquet. And I did for whatever reason. And he said, Joe's been working on his story of Vietnam, a chapter of which is in Running Recon. He said, "Would you be interested in working with Joe?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, I think I'd like to do that." So,
wow.
Joe sent me a copy of what he had written, which was, the sort of the early contents of SOG. Well, it didn't have a title even. It was just, Joe Parner's story or whatever. So, I went through it. Frank knew I had kind of literary interests, so I went through it and I said, "Yeah, this is really good." And I had a few suggestions, put more stuff in dialogue or, just some stuff here and there. And everything I did, I highlighted in red. And I sent it back to Joe and I said, "Here's what I've done with your story." I said, "It's your book. Anything you want is what we go with. If you don't like what I did, it's full of crap, so it's totally up to you." So I didn't know what he would say. So I was out one day and I came home and my wife said, "That guy Joe called you." She said, "Boy, does he have an accent?" Massachusetts, New England accent. And I said, "Yeah." She said, "He said to tell you that he really liked everything you did, all the changes you made, and he really thinks you made a much better book." And so anyway, I was greatly relieved, called him. Frank had put us in touch with some people at Paladin. John Ford was his editor of Running Recon, who edited a lot of stuff. So we worked with this guy, John Ford, at people at Paladin. And, it kind of came along and they chose the format. They chose the photo for the cover. And they did the hardcover that you were holding up, but they did 200 hardcovers, limited edition. And then they did a paperback version of it. So, and Joe wanted everything. He thought hardcover was far superior to paperback. I said, "Well, yeah, Joe, but we'll sell more paperback. More people will see the book, So, but we got them. They came to the books were printed just in time for SOAR a year or two later. So we started selling them. We had a vendor's table of our own at that point. So we started selling the hardcover and the paperback, and that was the first. Let's say that was 2006, 2007, maybe something like that.
Wow.
And
Mr.
so that's that.
No, go ahead.
Kind of had its run. We sold it there for years. So, I mean, that's all we had. We talked about maybe doing something else, and like the Wolf Kyle book, we did a kind of a tribute book to John Kettenberg, just desktop published 3-ring binder kind of thing, where we accumulated a lot more information. Over the years, we were getting more information.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of things in that first SOG Medic where Joe was on a helicopter. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Well, the pilot was doing this." Well, as time went on, we found out who the pilot was. And we just found out a lot more personal stuff. So we thought we had to, could improve the book. But Paladin didn't really want to do anything further with it. So we just kind of said, "Okay, well," we thought about self-publishing and stuff, but eventually we made our way to Casemate, and they took the book. So.
I'm trying to let me grab that edition.
That was the SOG Khantoum book that you did later, right, Bob?
No, the next book I had done an earlier book with a guy Joe had served with, a medic. He wasn't in SOG, but he's in a special forces camp. Yeah,
there we go. There's the
that's the second one, and that's how we got to casemate. Jerry Kruzan. He and Joe went through medics training together. Joe had me work with him on a book, which I was kind of reluctant to get into it, but once I started reading what he'd written, I said, well, I think maybe we could do it. And then I was looking around what to do. We thought maybe self-publish or something, which I didn't really know that much about, but I knew it was a thing. But I did some research, found a military publisher, casemate. So I wrote him a pitch letter, what the book was about, who would want to read it and why, kind of thing. And we kind of got through the hurdles. And eventually they said, yeah, we'll take the book. And so Jerry and I worked on that book for a year or two or something like that. And Joe wrote the foreword to it. I don't know if you noticed that, but and so Joe's in that, because they used to get in fights down in when they're in school together. But anyway, so we did that. I wrote Casemate kind of a two. We had in mind what became SOG Khantoum. We didn't have a title for it, and then SOG Medic. We said, well, we got SOG Medic is ours to do with as we please. We have this other book we're thinking about doing. It would be a variety of stories. And they said, well, that sounds good, but we really want SOG Medic. So I said, oh, okay. So we rewrote SOG Medic and made all our changes to it. So
both parties win.
And 2018 is when it came out.
Wow. And both great books. I hope all of y'all have gotten SOG Khantoum and SOG Medic, but if y'all have not gotten this or have not seen this book, it really is a great book.
It's out of print. You can still get it, but they never did a paperback of Box C either. So
I'm a hard reader, so I've got a few paperbacks, but I usually have to get hardcovers because I just bend the spines out of there.
There's an ebook and a hardcover, but there's no paperback.
I'll link that into the show notes. How soon until you started, did y'all link up and ever speak about you beginning your process on Uncommon Valor, or how did your Uncommon Valor idea, shall we say, start?
Yeah, I mean, Bob is obviously married to Wilson's wife. I'm sorry, Bob's brother and sister with Wilson's wife. So we've known each other and talked a little bit over the time. And Jan would say, "Hey, you need to talk to my brother Bob. He's done these books," and she'd bring his books to the family reunions, and I got to reading Bob's books and Joe.
No, I didn't know that. So, okay, yeah.
And because I was learning more about what Wilson did years before I even decided I'm going to sit him down and get him into talking. And Bob and I met up probably in person the first time at SOAR, but we'd talked on the phone. Yeah. And I was doing the research, and some of it started at the family reunion where I would just take my digital recorder, turn that thing on, and maybe after a couple of beers late at night, I'd get Wilson going on the stories. And as Bob knows, he's reluctant. He's a little bit humble to, toot his own horn. And I'd have to dig in going, well, hold on, before you got on the ground, so to speak, what's going on? Where did you go from? Who's with you? How many people? And you had to dig the details out of him. But once he realizes you're interested, he got more in depth into telling each of those stories.
He would use the terms, and I'd say, well, what's covey? What does that mean? What's the covey writer? What does that mean? And he would sort of use the lingo, and I'd have to say, well, wait, tell me, what does that mean? And then he'd mention people all the time. He's always saying, oh, Pappy Webb, Gerald Dennison, Tony Love, so I had all these names of people too that I had never met. So I'd ask Joe, actually, when I first met him, I said, yeah, my brother-in-law. I told him it was about my brother-in-law. And I said, yeah, he told me about a guy named Tony Love. And he said he didn't tell me all the background on it. He said, I always wondered what happened to him. And why did he volunteer to go on this mission with me that I thought we were all going to be killed? The suicide mission. And Joe's first time I met Joe, he said, "Oh, I know Tony Love." He said, "Yeah, I served with Tony Love." He said, "I know why he went on that mission." I said, "Well, why?" And he says, "Because he's the crazy son of a bitch." That's why. Finally, I got to meet Tony Love later on in person out in California. I was visiting, and I told him that, and he just laughed. I mean, he said, "Yeah, you got that right." Yeah.
Oh, he'll be the first to admit it.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
He was pretty close with some of the guys that went to SOAR every year, like Lou DeSeta, and he said, "You got to meet Lou. You got to talk to him." And so I
Yeah,
did, and got a bunch of Lou's stories. But some of the
yeah.
guys didn't go to SOAR. Like one of his teammates, Bill Jank, big burly guy, and he'd tell all these stories about Jank over and over. And I said, "Well, I
Yeah,
want to
I
talk
heard
to
a
him."
lot of jank stories. Yeah,
And it went on for a year or two, and I couldn't talk to him. Well, I'll try to reach out, and Wilson's always going to do something and never gets around to it. So I finally got the number. I
yeah,
said,
yeah,
Let me reach out to Mr. Jank." And it was kind of like you said on some of those that are reluctant. He kind of said, "Well, you need to figure out who you are and what this is about. We can't really talk about this kind of stuff." And so I started going through the prisoner snatch mission, where back to back missions. They pulled two prisoners out, first ones to do it in about 9 months' time. He's like,
yeah.
"Who did
The
you talk
same.
to on all this?" And I'm saying, "Well, Wilson Hunt and Ed Lassane." He's like, "You talked to Captain Lassane?" I said, "I did. Yeah, I've been in touch with him." And then the next call, he opened up a little more and he started telling some more details and started talking about Wilson chewing his ass for blowing up things at the LZ without having permission to do so. And kind of the
Yeah,
ice had been broken. And that's kind of how it is with these guys. They've got to establish who you are and what you're up to and what it's about. And, are you full of it, or you kind of have a good intent with what you're doing? And once we got into some of those missions, the prisoner snatch mission was insane, just how that
yeah. That's
happened.
a great. Yeah, yeah. It
Jenks,
was.
there's a long story to it, but he's actually got his hand in a cast. He's got a broken hand from a fight at the base after a few
Yeah,
drinks. And
he was fighting. I think he was fighting with Phil Brown actually. So,
Phil Brown had rammed another guy's head, Lowe's head, into the refrigerator that they had and smashed his fridge. And so Pappy Webb hands him a steel rod, says, "Go in there, Jack, and
yeah,
take care of it." And he goes, "I don't need a steel rod." He went in there with his fist and beat Scarface Brown's head into the ground with his fist
yeah,
until he broke his own hand. And he caught so much grief over that. But when they went back in to pull this mission, he shows up on that day and says, "I'm going, cast or no cast. I can heal in the field or I can heal at the base." And he was part of that mission where they pulled the first prisoner with
yeah.
Lassane, come back and find out they'd pulled an officer. And 2 days later, they
That's
sent
the
him back
photo that's
in.
in the thing you showed before with the guy on the ground.
Yeah, Bud's got the photo there of that POW on the
Yeah,
ground, the first one they
yeah,
captured. And
yeah.
they
James
sent him back
that
in with a
photo.
hatchet force team to blow up the ammo supply area. And Wilson ends up in a shootout with an NVA, wounds him, crawls back under fire, and Lassane says, "Well, go back and find out what happened to him.
Yeah,
Go get him
yeah,
if he's
yeah,
alive." It's like,
yeah.
"You're kidding me." So he had to crawl back with Jank and make sure the guy wasn't booby trapped with a hand grenade and, get him
Well,
back to the
he
choppers.
you remember when they went back in, they went with like a platoon or something.
Right.
That guy Hart, I think the guy's name, or Hartley, I can't remember. And Wilson and Jank got on the ground. They picked the platoon was out doing something in the field. The helicopters picked up the platoon en route when they were going back to where they'd snatched the prisoner. I think Jank and Wilson were on the ground first, and then the platoon comes in, and they're like, they're making all this noise. They're like, breaking up cartons, from insect repellent, and Jank and Wilson are like thinking, well, I think we may have to do some E&E here if this goes on much longer. But and so they kind of were in the wood line observing all this. So anyway, that's the way Wilson had remembered it.
Yeah, I think they ended up tripping an ambush and saving some of the guys. And in the process, he wounds one, and Lassane says, "You're going back there to see if that guy's alive." And sure enough, they ended up bringing their second prisoner out within a 3-day period. I think September 25th, and
Lassane
then
was
again on
freaking out.
the 27th.
Lassane was freaking out because he couldn't find the radio. The guy, the American who led the platoon, was having a panic attack or something, sitting under a tree, freaking out. And somehow one of the yards had ended up with the team radio, but Jank didn't know where it was. So he was he was all upset. I think Jank finally found the guy with the radio. He picked up the yard and holding the radio and took him over and threw him and said, "Here's your fucking radio here." So then
That's exactly how he said it. Yep.
Insane Lassane. From what I've heard, I could hear him telling somebody, "You're going back out there to find out if he's dead or not."
Yeah. Wilson and Lassane really had a good thing. I don't have it at hand, but Lassane wrote Wilson a really nice letter after he got back. After Wilson got back to the United States, and Jank was Lassane was in Saigon at that time. He wasn't at the FOB anymore, and I don't know. I should have got it out anyway. One time when I was in Tulsa with Wilson, we were going through his stuff, and he found the letter and he showed it to me. So last time I was there, I was able to go through some of Wilson's stuff. I didn't have time to go through everything, but I found that letter and I brought it back with me. So let's just say I got it some here and all my shit here next to me. But and then Lassane came to SOAR. You were there when Lassane came. Were you
I was not there that year, no.
Oh, okay. He came a couple of years, and because he lived in Panama, he retired. He's from North Carolina, South Carolina. His family has come.
Yeah, we talked and emailed a few times, and then he of course passed away a few years back. But was able to talk to all three of the guys on those prisoner snatch missions and get every different perspective. And each guy in the field, what you see and what the next guy sees, it's a different firefight for each person. If you're 50 yards apart for a few minutes,
Yeah, he came and Lee Swain visited him in Panama. Actually, Swain's kind of a world traveler now. He goes everywhere, but he visited Lassane in Panama. But Lassane came to SOAR the same year all the helicopter pilots started coming. And they were talking about Wilson saw Bill Groves. First time he'd seen him since, that we're skipping around here. The Bryant Bright Light mission, if you're familiar with that. That was when Wilson was supposed to have deroast. It was past his deroast date, but Lassane convinced him and I can't remember the other guy's name to go out to look for Bryant, the guy who was missing in action.
I think it was Wayne Melton, one of his buddies.
Yeah, that's
Melton.
Right. Yeah, and Bryant was the guy they were looking for, who, according to Phil Brown, had gone missing twice before that. Once before that and once after that, and and Bill Groves was the head of the hatchet platoon to go look for Bryant. Lassane went on the mission, but Groves was the calling the shots, and Bingo was the Covey writer that day too. And Wilson went, and there's a whole chapter in SOG Tomb on the Bryant Bright Light missions that we got from a variety of sources. But Wilson, when he and Bill Groves saw each other for the first time since October of 1968. And they immediately recognized each other. And Wilson said, he looks exactly like he did, except he's got white hair, but he looks exactly the same. And he's still full of piss and vinegar. And Lassane was there. And then they were talking about when they found Bryant, how they got him out or something, took him in what helicopter. Because there was a big, Groves was on the, left on the LZ, had got off the helicopter, and somebody had fallen off the helicopter. Wilson was on an earlier helicopter, like the second or third helicopter out, and they were getting hits. And Wilson said the door gunner freaked out, and the door gunners started screaming, "We're going down! We're going down!" And Wilson's thinking, "Oh shit! I'm supposed to be on an airplane going back to the U.S. I'm on this goddamn helicopter. It's about to crash, but luckily it didn't crash." But anyway, he and Groves were talking about that whole mission. It was quite interesting.
One of the interesting ones, actually, Bob helped me out when I was writing the book. Talking to Wilson, doing the interviews, and he got to one point, he was talking about this one mission, a Bright Light, where he was supposed to go in and try to find a downed pilot or find his body or find the wreckage. And
Yeah,
they
yeah,
said, I never figured out who it was or what happened to him or any of that stuff. And I said, well, yeah, just not being cocky. I've done a lot of World War II books and had to unravel tales. And I said, yeah, we'll figure it out. We'll figure out, who the pilot was. It shouldn't be that hard to do. And he looked at me and said, well, good luck with that, because I've been trying to figure it out for 50 years. Well,
yeah,
I said, what was the date of the mission? He goes, I don't know. Okay, let's frame this up. Let's narrow your window down. And we got from March to April to May to maybe
yeah,
about June of 1968 to maybe the end of August 68, based on events that Wilson did that were documented in September. So it's okay, it had to be the summer of 68. So how many A1 Sky Raiders went down in this area and how many pilots were not found? And pretty quickly narrowed it down through a book I borrowed from him to a guy
yeah.
I
The
thought had to be the right
USA
fit.
Air
And I
Force
reached out,
lost is
read
very
some
easy on
accounts
them,
online about the family and what they knew. And they said all they knew was that some Green Berets or some Special Forces guys had gone in to look for him. And all they could ever find was a charred piece of flight helmet. And that's exactly the story that Wilson had told, that they found the charred flight helmet, but not the
yeah.
body. And so I kind of reached out to Bob, said, hey, here's this family. What do you think about trying to get in touch with this Wolf Kyle family? And Bob, you might want to share, you kind of reached out and took over at that point, making connections.
Yeah, I was just Googling, this is our, trying to figure things out. And so once we decided it was this family, we found a phone number for a guy named David Wolf Kyle. We didn't know how to pronounce it. We called the number, but it was disconnected. So I did some further searching. I found a wedding announcement for a young lady named Veronica Wolf Kyle. She lived in Georgia. And had just the usual thing. Had the photos of her and the happy couple and everything like that. So it said she worked at a law firm, and so I called just at work again. I said, well, let me call this number. So I called the number of the law firm. I said, do you have a Veronica Wolfkiel? I said we thought it was Wolfkiel at the time, who works there, and the receptionist or the phone operator said, oh yeah, she's here now having lunch at her desk. You want to talk to her? And I said, oh yeah, sure. So then I thought, how am I gonna present this? So I kind of got it all out, and she listened and she said, my dad's going to want to hear all this. So I said, okay. So I think then, and she said the phone number that's online, that's a landline, here's his cell phone number. So I gave you the cell phone number. And I think you made the initial phone call to Dave.
Yeah, I reached out to Wilson to, say, hey, the son would really love to talk to you about all this. And Wilson's kind of this, he's like, I don't know, because the guy didn't make it back. I don't want to give them false hope. I don't want to open up fresh wounds, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, let me talk to him. So I talked to David Wolf Kyle for a long time, like an hour or so. And I said, my Uncle Wilson would like to talk to you, but he's scared to hurt the family's feelings, dredge up all this. And he goes, I absolutely want to talk to him. And once they connected, I mean, the story just unfolded. Eventually went back and figured out who the team was, RT Florida, that went in and got shot out originally when Major Wolf Kyle was flying cover, and tracked down Richard Vanderswam, talked to him. He was the 1-0. And then he couldn't remember who his 1-1 was. And I figured out it probably was Ralph Rod. But I talked to Ralph. And he said, I didn't make it on the ground on that mission. I said, well, were y'all shot up or shot out? And he goes, well, yeah, actually, come to think of it, Richard got down on the ground, but I was in the second chopper. It went to hell and we got shot out of there. I never got boots on the ground. They pulled us out and they had to get Vanderswam pulled out. The SPAD crashes in the midst of all this. And it's weeks before Wilson's team is sent in to go try to recover the body. But the beauty of the story was years later at SOAR, the whole family, Bob was there, Wilson was there, the Wolf Kyle family came out, and they got to relive the mission and talk about it. And Wilson got to tell the story, and he was emotional, as you can imagine, in front of the family talking about all this stuff, I
remember when they came, we all went downstairs and we're all, introducing ourselves to one another. And I remember looking at Wilson. He was just still kind of like standing, a little standoffish, or like he just didn't know how to
approach the situation. Yeah,
nervous.
Yeah. So and then I told you guys the other day, I said to the parents, Dave and his wife, I said, I really apologize for calling your daughter, after finding her name on a, wedding announcement. I said, so how was the wedding? And they said, oh, they didn't get married. We never liked that guy anyway. So it worked out right. But there was a whole bunch of them. And then they were acknowledged during the banquet. And I guess they had a SPAD presentation.
Yeah, that was the
everybody.
most moving part for me, was because these guys are looking at it from two different points of view. These Green Berets and SOG are talking about, you guys are crazy. You're coming in and dropping napalm and machine gun and bullets and bombs right on top of people. You're getting your choppers and your aircraft and your jets shot up. We can't believe y'all would come in just to do that for us 6 to 10 guys. And they're going, we can't believe you're stupid enough to be on the ground doing what you're doing.
They all thought the other guys were crazy.
Exactly.
But,
and so they started coming to SOAR more frequently, different aviation groups, and it just became a family of those guys. And it was awesome to hear them tell both sides.
Tilt went out to their thing they have in Tennessee every year for the pilots. So Tilt started going to that, and then he invited them all to come to SOAR.
He and Gene McCarley were the first two that actually went up there to bridge the gap, shall we say.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, Tilt did a whole presentation there.
Gene was with him, actually. He's actually mentioning, I'm sure most of y'all follow it, and I'm blanking on it. We watched the video, which we'll get into, I'm sure, in a minute, of Mr. Wilson and the Wolf Kyle's son linking up for an interview.
Yeah. I've seen that online, yeah.
That's the same organization that works at the Tennessee Museum.
Yeah. What's the guy's name who does the museum? He's come to SOAR a few times.
He does, and I am blanking.
I can remember.
Combat Stories is the YouTube page, guys. I can't remember anything else other than that. How did that go about with Mr. Wilson at first being rightly so apprehensive, warming up, telling his story and all of that? How did y'all get him to?
I think getting to know Don Ingebretson pretty well, and Don kind of facilitated things, and the more comfortable he got telling the story,
because he goes into great detail in that video with the son sitting right by his side. It's very moving.
Yeah, he and David had talked a lot. By the time that they were all at the Tennessee Museum, they'd gotten to know each other pretty well. So
and even there at SOAR, it was pretty emotional. Banquet night, they have the honor ceremony for the guys that didn't come back, and in addition to the Green Berets, they honored Major Wolf Kyle at that ceremony, and the family had no idea that was going to take place, and it really got to them.
Yeah, you were seated with them, as I recall, and
great family.
I didn't know. Yeah.
They became close with Wilson, and then years later, when he got inducted into the Oklahoma Military Hall of Fame, David came down, and just in honor of Wilson to be part of that ceremony, and took part of that, and it was moving for Wilson. There they are together, David and George Wilson.
Yeah.
And right here, guys, follow this page. The videos that Mr. Bob was speaking about, Tilt and all of the guys, they're all right here. I can't recommend that site highly enough. And y'all watch this video because Mr. Wilson opens up a great deal about a very, very tough mission that the gentlemen are speaking about right now.
Yeah. He over the years going to SOAR, and I introduced him to Joe, and he knew Phil Brown, and a lot of people he knew anyway. So we had kind of the FOB2 group of people, and so he really enjoyed coming to that until he really he couldn't really make it any longer. But and as I say, he went early on. It was too wild. He was in the active in his SFA chapter locally, and but the SOG SOA was I don't know. But then he got really where he enjoyed coming. He got to know everybody, and And
Once they settled down a bit, it was Animal House on steroids in those early
well, I watched your interview with Brockhausen and heard those stories.
days.
Have you seen that, Steve? The
I haven't watched
interviews
that one. I'll have to go back and catch it.
That he barely went into offline. What he went into was just
they were playing cards, and a guy goes in the bathroom to take a crap and dies of a heart attack, and they don't know what to do with him. So they said, "Well, we'll get a bunch of ice. Ice, put him in the bathtub with ice." Continued the card game. Brockhausen's stories are just amazing, you know. But,
the Hunter Thompson of SOG.
Yeah, but he's like, he's like, you know, how they started letting these non-SOG people in, you know.
Especially for somebody like me, a non-SOG person, there were definitely some stories I heard told over a few drinks at the store that did not make it into print and reference, you know, to families that don't want to read some of those stories, you know.
Oh yeah, not safe for work nor for book publishing.
No.
That not going to work out. I for guys that haven't read it, before we kind of segue into Mr. Bob here, one of the most important group for FOB2 wise, and pretty interesting, and you actually got to meet him, which I didn't know till we spoke or this weekend. And I've had the honor to meet Mr. Leonard Tilley and Mr. Jim Hetrick, two of the original 33. Did you speak about the original 33 of FOB2 and how you got to meet them and write about them?
Yeah, I kind of started with Wilson Hunt and his story, but then the more I got into it, when I read how many distinguished service crosses and Medal of Honors were earned by these men at FOB2 and CCC, it was astounding. And I met a lot of these guys at SOAR and realized I kind of need to backtrack and start with the base getting up and running in '66 and the the temporary guys that are there, and then the first, as they call themselves, the original 33 that were assigned to not only get the base up and running, but literally build some of the buildings, kind of an old truck park, they'd inherited off the highway there, and just improving on it, and eventually building the yard camp that Ed Lassane and some of them and Mo Worley helped recruit the yards, and talking with JD Bath and some of the early guys that were helping to, get the indigenous teams together. Mr. Tilley, Jimmy Stewart, Al Keller, Steve Goff, Jim Hetrick. Got to speak to a number of those guys, Billy Joe Anthony, Jan Boric, guys that ran with Dick Meadows. He was kind of the premier prisoner snatching team leader. They had wild and crazy missions that we touch on a few of those in the book there. But I felt it was important to go from the early part on up to where Wilson comes in '68, because there's so much history of the base prior to him getting there, and so many heroes that preceded him. Mr. Worley and all these others that got the DSC, we talked about Zabatowski, Ken Sisler, Leonard Tilley was considered for the Medal of Honor, probably deserved to get it. He got the nation's second highest honor insteed. Yeah. But he said, "Hey, give me a case of whiskey and I'll call it a done deal with that." And he got what he asked for, and continued to
Mr.
run.
Tilley had a document or something that he was giving to people. He gave me a copy of it about what he did during that, during the Sisler thing. And and
I've heard more to that.
He should have got the Medal of Honor.
I'll tell y'all offline. I've heard more of that personally from him. I won't go in anymore. I'll tell y'all offline about something and see what y'all think about that. But he definitely should have earned the Medal of Honor for what he did that day.
He did a lot that day, yeah, and he probably swallowed his pride a little bit and took the medal he was given, but he's very worthy of that and more, for sure.
Absolutely. When you first got to SOAR and really started getting introduced to the original 33, how many of the 33 were still around? I know of course, as we mentioned offline, guys were passing away in the 80s and such, and some of them were quite old by that time, and Mr. Tilley's in his 80s. How many were around or were able to contribute?
There were probably a few. I want to say Steve Goff and Al Keller I probably talked to in person. Some I ended up getting phone numbers and connections through some of their buddies or through Jason Hardy or somebody
Mhm.
else. And then we started going back and talking about the early days. And then Major Crear, Scotty Crear,
Yes.
even got to talk to Frank Jacks, who was, I believe, a major at that time.
Mhm.
A couple of the officers that were there in the early days and running the first bright lights. Yeah, there's some of the 33 right there.
Terrible
Uh,
quality.
They
I
had a
apologize about it,
they,
guys.
they had a dinner some years ago for the whoever was left of the original 33. I didn't know quite what it was, but I learned about it at that time, and I don't know who all was there, but that was several years ago that they did that. So
I mean, they got up and running with a half dozen or so teams, and then of course you got injuries and losses. There was a crash, a chopper crash in July of '66 that took out the better part of a team, and so you've always got a team in a state of disarray or in a state of rebuild because of death, injury, malaria, whatever else is going on. And then it's quite some time before FOB2 ever gets up to the slated number of teams they're supposed to have running missions. They were well short of that, like half strength for some period of time.
That was very surprising reading the book because that's one thing that really got me hooked in is that you were not just running through missions, which you cover a lot of missions, but you were breaking down kind of like actually like Mr. Joe did in SOG Medic, the inner workings of what was going around, not only between people to people, but team to shall we say S2 or the officers or what have you. It was just astounding of what they had to work with and what they were accomplishing early on at that rate.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of interesting stories, the base bar getting up and running and, Bobby Barnes becoming the base bar manager later because he's too big to be pulled out on strings anymore. Joe Walker shared a few stories like that. And Mr. Walker was definitely an honor to chat with him a few times and get a sampling of his stories. Yeah, he deserves a book on him, as do,
Gosh,
Mad Dog and a few other people that may eventually get a book. But Pappy Webb and Joe Walker were some of the well-respected 1-0s that were there when Wilson came in. There's Bob Howard with looks like Poole that ran some missions with him. Howard came in as basically a supply sergeant when he was assigned there. He was kind of
that's
new to SOG, assigned to FOB2, and he ends up, in supply room running that, and that's not what he wanted. But
no,
he'd
no.
already been wounded. He'd been over there in
why
'66.
was he not running missions early on anyway?
Well, he'd been over there. He'd gone in more with the 101st Airborne when he first did his
Yeah,
tour
yeah,
of
I knew.
Vietnam,
Yeah,
and
I
he
knew
was
he was
shot
a
in the
regular.
head, shot in the face. Bullet. He had a
Hmm.
scar on his cheek where the bullet broke out some teeth and went through his face. And he met up with some SF guys in the hospital there,
Yeah.
and he was
Hmm.
astounded. The SAW guys in there that he'd done some training with years back.
Hmm.
And here comes his colonel in to check on the SAW guy. How you doing, son? Blah blah blah. And he's laying there going,
Okay.
well, what the hell? Nobody's come to check on me. I'm sitting there with a bullet through my face, and people could care less. And his buddy says, "Hey, this sergeant here, he'd make a hell of a guy to run recon and get into SAW or into special forces," I think he said. And the colonel said, "Well, give me your name and rank and all this, blah blah blah." And not too long later, Howard gets the call to go through training and complete special forces training and make the first steps towards SOG and earned his
When did
combat infantry badge.
What year could you
yeah, when
clear
did he
this
get
up
to
because
Khartoum?
there's a misconception because there's several men in SOG that were not SF qualified. Blue to Seda being one that's well known. What year did Mr. Bob graduate from training group?
He started this, he was wounded in '66 when he went over there in July of '66, I believe. I'm doing this by memory.
Mhm.
And was wounded in the fall. And during that recovery, went back and he was in country for a few more months and he
Wow.
earned his combat infantry badge. And somebody wrote a book on him and said, that's a mistake. You only get that for direct combat, blah, blah, blah. But I've got his records where it's from 5th Special Forces Group that he got that. He earned that over there. So he was indeed active in the field, doing probably in-country patrols or different missions.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't write or say a whole lot about some of that period, but he goes back stateside for a period of time, for the better part of '67. And it's not until later in '67 that he comes back on his next tour of Vietnam, and processes in, and he's sent to FOB2, where he's going to be the supply sergeant. And that it's a whole story in itself on Bob Howard, but he's quick to go out as a strap hanger because he's gung ho. He wants to fight. He didn't like the kind of fighting he had when he was first wounded over there, so he wants to go out with the teams. And you've got Larry White and some of these guys that ended up taking him out.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
Drawing a
Mike
blank on a couple of the
Shepard
others.
is
Yeah.
a good one.
Who was the camp commander at that time, or the chief officer? Who did he
Was
have
it
to
Roy
convince
Barr?
to let him go?
Barr came in a little bit later. There were several. He kind of had a rotating door in '67, '68. They had
There was
a few that were not there for very long
Yeah.
lengths of time.
Mm-hmm.
But Barr was there at one point for a good period of time.
Maybe
and
just showed up. Maybe just jumped on the helicopter. Here we go.
yeah, but he got out with a few of the guys, and Mr. White shared some stories of some of the first missions, and Bob Howard was always gung ho to go. Let's find the enemy. Let's initiate contact. And they're like, no, we're in here to snoop and poop. They said we're in here to do a mission, do what we're assigned, to get out without getting shot up in certain particular objectives. But Bob was always ready to mix it up and get into combat, and he found that in time for sure.
Oh, he did in spades. He did.
Gene McCarley was another one that took him out on some missions as a strap hanger. Unfortunately, Mr. McCarley had passed before I decided to do this Howard book, and I didn't have the chance to in-depth interview on some of that, but he'd given me some stories, 7 or 8 years back.
Yeah.
Wow. That, and I'm trying to find that photo, and of course, now that I've got it, it's Mr. Gene, Bill Boyle, and Mr. Bob standing around a 3/4 ton. That's just all the experience, not just recon, but military experience. Standing in front of that 3/4 ton is just God Almighty.
Yeah, I think that picture you're talking about, a couple of those guys didn't live much longer beyond that.
They
I think
did
Boyle
not.
was killed, and I'm trying to think of who a couple of the other guys were in that photo, but he lost a lot of guys there. And
I was just sadly going to bring that up, that unfortunately in the years that he was there, we hear so much about, like you said, he was supply, that even Mr. Joe, one of the funny stories, and Mr. Terry, as soon as I talked to him, they walk in and they had already started hearing about Bob Howard, and then they walk in and they don't notice the armorer guy giving out their gear and everything. And it's like, oh, go see Bob. He's like, that's Bob Howard in the supply and all of that. And it's like, oh yeah, that's Bob back in there. It's it's crazy hearing that, but then how quick he could go from flipping that switch, like you said, wanting to get out there, get in the action, and then it's just astounding. What he had to go through, could you talk to any of his family, friends, Larry White or anything? He really did, not only the personal injuries, he suffered a lot of personal losses, close friends that died in SOG.
Yeah, a couple of guys that Larry Williams and Larry White, ran missions with him early on. I talked to Mr. Williams early on back in 2014, I think.
Oh,
He's
wow.
passed, but Larry White is still with us, and he went back last year, and we talked about some of the early missions with Bob Howard and how that went. And just even some of the guys that didn't necessarily run missions with him, like Lou DeSeta. Lou had a great story about being in the supply shack one day with what would eventually be 3 Medal of Honor guys, Keddenberg, Zabatowski, and Howard, and how he gets his SOG knife, and that's a whole story in itself. But
That's his first day on the compound, isn't it?
pretty much his first week or two there, your first few days, wasn't it, Bob?
Well, Kettenberg came a little after. What was the guy's name who was the 1-0?
Howard Taylor.
Yeah, Taylor.
Yeah.
Lou did a few missions with him, but then when John came, I guess John had a bayonet or knife or something. Anyway, Lou thought it was real cool, and that's why they went over to supply to see if they could get one for Lou. And Howard said, "Well, we don't have that." He says, "Well, we got something else." He goes in back. He comes back with this, big SOG knife. Lou says, "Oh yeah, that'll do. That'll be fine." And
that'll work.
Zabatowski was after he was nominated for the Medal of Honor, so he wasn't doing missions. He was just working with Wilson on RT Maine. And so he was just there shooting the shit with Howard, and Kettenberg and Lou come in. So Lou, always tells that story about how, he was there with the 3 Medal of Honor recipients. So it's kind of in retrospect. At the time, he didn't think anything about it,
Nah.
but.
And he talked about Happy Webb and Howard almost getting into it at the base one night, probably after a few drinks at the bar, and he thought somebody's going to die here. And little did he know, but he'd end up running. Our partner was telling some of that story too, that he'd run a mission both with Webb and with Howard later.
Yeah.
So Joe shared stories, Joe Parner, and quite a few guys that I could track down most recently.
Yeah.
A few guys that served with him later when he was Recon Company commander at CCC. After he'd been, written up and couldn't go to the field anymore.
That he not for a lack of trying now, not for a lack of trying, because I've gotten numerous talks from some of the guys, Mike Shepard specifically, about trying to sneak him out, even for a local, and them literally flooding the helipad and dragging him off the helicopter, saying no.
I think Mr. Shepard shared that story. The colonel comes up and looks in there. He goes, "What in the hell are you doing, Howard? Get out of that chopper right now." He's going in. It's a bright light. He's going in to save one of his guys if he can, and he's like, "Get your blankety blank out of that chopper right now."
I mean, you gotta.
He left for a while. Then he came back as Recon Company commander or something. What was it? But
he went back a few times. He was badly wounded in '68 and had to really struggle to get mission notes and find some things on that. But he was shot up, had to go to Japan for treatment, back stateside. And while he was stateside, he received 8 different medals at one ceremony that's documented at the base there. And he gets back late in 1968, just in time to go on the famous Slam 7 mission with Joe Walker. And that's where Lee Swain is wounded. And that's, Bob and Joe have told that story in 2 of their books, And Howard pulls a prisoner on that particular mission. In fact, there's a couple pictures I shared with you, Bud, that some people may not have seen.
Oh, yes.
This is on the Slam mission where Bob Howard, according to himself, he was wounded at least 14 times. He was only given the Purple Heart 8 times, but he said basically some of them you just didn't bother to write up or didn't document. Yeah. And I've talked to other vets. So there's Bob Howard, November of '68, coming back from the Slam 7 mission. He's got the prisoner over his shoulder, carrying him through the compound. And there's another picture where he's got the POW on the ground with a bag on his head. And Howard's got a beer in his hand. He's just, gotten off at the helipad. And I think you may have that one there too.
This one, as far as I know, has not been seen at least by me, and I can assume the rest of our crowd. I was shocked when you had this one in the Silver Pistol. This is an amazing photograph.
This is in the book, Steve?
This is going to be in the book, yeah. And if you notice, he's kind of got a poncho wrapped around his crotch and his waist, what he called a field diaper. He'd taken shrapnel in the buttocks and back and other places. So he's just, got these, bloodied pieces of, rain fabric there. He's got wrapped around him just to kind of keep his fatigues together. So his ass isn't hanging out of his pants for the rest of the mission, basically. But he didn't come out on the chopper. He came out with his POW. And the Yards had actually taken out the first 2 NVA that walked out of the forest and tried to surrender. And the Yards went nuts and started gunning them down. And Steve Roach and some of the guys were screaming, "Stop, stop, stop your shooting." And Howard's raising hell trying to get them to stop. And so a little bit later, when another NVA comes walking out trying to surrender, Howard just runs out there and tackles the guy and takes him down and brings him back, carrying him into the perimeter. And the officer in charge there just about lost his mind because he's like, what are you doing bringing this guy back in here? But we spent a lot of time going through that and trying to get the facts straight on that particular mission, especially some of the guys that led the mission. Bob, you've talked to some of them as well over the years, I believe.
Yeah.
But incredible stories.
Yeah. I've talked to Lee Swain, because he and Bob Howard were more or less walking point on, leading the procession there. And Tom Yeager said he wanted, those were his two lieutenants on the SLAM operation. He figured one of them should be leading, but didn't want both of them. But anyway, that's when Swain was wounded, so they had to.
Swain was wounded badly, ended up losing one of his legs. And then Yeager was the mission commander after the first captain they put in kind of proved to be not able to handle it, let's say. And we go into pretty good detail, but Colonel Yeager went through that with me in great detail, trying to make sure all the facts matched up. I did go back and talk to some of these guys again last year that were on the SLAM mission and just go through and make sure they verified this is the way it went down, and we get the story as accurately as we can at this late date. And really appreciate that. There's Tom Yeager.
Yeah. The SLAM mission, and Frank Greco's running recon. There's kind of Joe's contribution to that. There was stuff about the SLAM, and so when we were doing the first SOG Medic, that was kind of the centerpiece of the book. But then as time went on, we got we learned more about it and figured out where it was, and got a little bit more information. Then got the helicopter pilots, which is not in the first SOG Medic. We got to know Craig Collier and Carl Hauck, the 57th AHC, and in the updated SOG Medic, we included a whole lengthy account of Carl Hauck, who was coming in to pick up wounded people on the SLAM and ended up getting shot down and crashing and on the ground. So that's stuff like that we could add to. Well, it was pretty much a done deal. I have right here. We got this years ago. Carl Hauck's Vietnam thing. He's got a whole thing on that. And Hauck was the one who was it that fell off the string when the guy that fell off the string?
Fred Krupa?
No.
On a different mission.
Yeah, I know. In October of 68.
68.
I'm drawing a blank at the moment too.
Yeah, we talked about that the other day, and I've got so many names in my head that.
Yeah, I know. I've wrote so much shit down here too. Like,
now I'm gonna be mad.
Bertram,
James Bertram.
Yeah. Hauck was the helicopter pilot. He was on Hauck's helicopter.
Wow.
And there's a whole thing in here about Hauck's version of what happened. He was with this guy Craig Collier. They were both on the SLAM. They were the assigned pickup people. And there's a big storm brewing, and Collier flew low, Hauck flew high. And, Hauck, he didn't know until he got back to Khartoum that, somebody was, he didn't know who he's picking up. Bertram wasn't there. Wilson knew Bertram. I don't know. Do you ever talk to you about Bertram?
A little bit, yeah. We talked about a number of people, different.
He said he was probably the nicest person he ever met in SOG was Jim Bertram. So,
I talked to one of his family members to get a picture of him for one of the books.
Yeah, and, his wife often comes to SOAR. So
right,
not every year, but she's been there a lot. She was, holding out hope that somehow he'd survive. But and she talked to Joe, but Joe.
There's Lee.
There's Lee Swain, so old SOG medic.
Yeah, talked to Mr. Swain again for the Howard book, and as many people as I could get a hold of. And Jason Hardy and Steve Sherman put me in touch with a few other guys that served with him a little bit later after the Medal of Honor mission, like Mike Shepard and 2 or 3 other guys. I'm drawing a blank. They'll be, Steve Hatch, he was a lieutenant, and they had some stories. So most people that knew Bob Howard said he was one of the few guys that would just run straight toward danger every time, didn't have an ounce of fear in his body. Tom Yeager talked about that and said, after the first mission with him, I knew this was a guy I could blindly trust. He's going to have my back. He's going to take care of me out there. And he, nearly lost his life trying to help save Lee Swain and work with Tom Yeager to get that SLAM mission to be as successful as it could be. But there were a lot of wounded on that mission.
yeah,
Yep.
that was a very very tough operation, and those slams were notorious for getting bloody. But I think that
Yeah,
one
but
pretty bad.
Joe was mentioned in SOG Medic, even the first one. He didn't lose anybody. Nobody
No,
died.
no,
So
no.
that was his great. As
They
a
had some
medic, that
yards
was his
killed on
great
that
point of
mission,
pride.
but they didn't lose
Yeah,
any Green Berets. That was where
right.
it started out with Joe Walker's RT California down,
Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
they have the ambush, and then that's where Floyd
Jesus.
first went missing with some of the yards, and they took cover up on a hilltop, and one of the NBA teams came in, a hunter killer team, and took out
No.
all the yards and shot up Floyd, shot him in the side of the head and in the crotch, and
Mhm, mhm,
Joe
God.
mhm.
Carner and Walker and Howard and all them went back up there and pulled Floyd down, got him back out of there, got him evac'd, and
Mhm.
saved his
Yeah,
life that day.
yeah.
That's one of the craziest stories. I mean, all of it's crazy, but them expecting to come up on everyone dead, which everyone was except for Floyd, and so, I can't remember if it was Bob or Joe that got to him and said, "Oh my God, I see something moving, either his brain or
Yeah, he said,
something."
"Damn,
Or
this one's alive over here," because the bullet had
Yeah,
gone
yeah,
through
no,
his
Joe,
head
yeah.
and
Well,
didn't.
Joe was the medic when they decided to go back across the river and see if there was anybody who wasn't killed. And so, and that,
Jesus.
he was the only American, I guess, who
To
was,
survive.
I
Yeah,
mean, he was killed, but he survived. Yeah,
yeah. I mean,
Um,
the
there
bullet
were some yards that
hit
were
his
killed.
skull and
So.
kind of ricocheted around through his face and came out without,
Yeah,
being a lethal shot.
yeah. I had some interesting conversation. I had read Frank Greco had published in. Oh, this is the book you say you can't get a copy of, Bud. The
yes,
contents
sir.
manual.
That
I've
one's
Yeah,
got that.
even
Yeah.
harder
yeah,
than running recon to get.
yeah, yeah. I got the copy number 8 of 65
Oh
from
wow.
the song, signed by Frank. Uh,
That's a good book.
anyway,
Good pictures.
yeah, that's the he wanted to, that's how Wilson got, he wanted the picture of, that one of the pictures Wilson had taken. But Frank, he couldn't do any color photos with Paladin, so he self-published that book with the Ex Libris,
Snowden
so he could
Hall
do the
there.
color photos.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Headquarters right there. I
Uh,
was gonna see about we'll guys those questions we'll get into some at the end of the show here. How did you what was it like getting to speak to either family members or Sogman or whoever was with him at this time during the medal ceremony with President Nixon and the likes?
Yeah, kind of funny story. I'll try to keep it quick because I know we're getting long on time here. But when I did Uncommon Valor, I tried to talk to people that were, either on each of those Medal of Honor missions or, men that took part. If the guy that was honored, like Zebedowski, didn't live through it, talk to the other guys that were
mhm.
still with us. And I wanted to talk to Bob Howard, of course, but he'd passed away. So I tried tracking down his family. I live in Texas. They live in Texas. And I'm pretty good at tracking people. At least I was a long time ago before all the constraints are out there that we have today. And I found out his son-in-law was one of the police chiefs over in another town here in Texas. Tracked down a number, got a hold of him, and basically he kind of read me the riot act of how did you get this number? This was his unpublished cell phone number. And I said, well, I do this. I'm pretty good at tracking stuff. He goes, that's not the question I ask you. And then it just kind of started on the wrong foot. So years later, when I got to working on the Howard story, I reached out to him again, and Frank said, "I read the book. I appreciate what you wrote about the colonel. I think you treated him fairly. Yeah, we're happy to talk to you. My wife Missy's interested. What do you want to do?" I said, "Well, I'll come down if you'd like." And they said, "Come on down." And so I drove down to where they live in Texas, maybe the next week. And Missy and Frank got out Bob Howard's scrapbooks and memorabilia, his army papers, and saw
Oh,
kind of pictures like that. Some of these you've seen before. The ones with the POW I had never seen before.
Oh,
And I knew there's a pretty famous picture of Bob Howard carrying a prisoner through the CCC compound, but that was actually in 1969 when RT Texas pulled a prisoner. This is after Howard's Medal of Honor mission when he's kind of on stand down where he's not allowed to go to the field. But when I saw this other one he's carrying, I'm like, hold on a minute, that has to be the SLAM mission from '68. And, sent the picture to Tom Yeager, who looked at it and said, "Oh yeah, we bagged him, put the bag on his head. That's that would have been from that mission."
That picture was in the field or back at the FOB?
The other picture that Bud showed a while ago, the two pictures of him carrying the prisoner over his shoulder, they were taken in the FOB, or back at the helipad at least.
After the SLAM, you mean?
Yeah, this is in '68 after RT Texas brought in a prisoner. You can see he's handcuffed and his legs are bleeding.
Yeah.
And Howard just scoops him up like a rag doll and carried him to the compound. But the other one was the mission that Joe Parner was on, where he brought back one in 1968 in November.
Mm-hmm. The SLAM, yeah.
So, and that's quite the drought. That not only did he catch or capture the last POW, but there he is in '69 with Dave Gilmer when they get off the bird, that he is the first person at the compound to lay their hands on a prisoner in 1969, which I think is pretty neat, that he's the last and the first to touch the prisoner there both times like that. That's a pretty neat little instance right there.
Yeah, if I recall right, they hadn't had one in about 9 months, and then Wilson Hunt and Lassane and Jank pulled two on September 25th and 27th, and then in November Howard comes back with a prisoner from the SLAM mission. So there were others later, but for a while there weren't that many coming out.
They got on the Bryant. I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
No, I was going to say in '66 and '67 there were more with Dick Meadows and some of those guys bringing people back, but there was a stretch where it was kind of a dry spell, and then
which you covered greatly in Uncommon Valor, absolutely superbly about that.
They got somebody on the Bryant Bright Light, as I recall, which was when Wilson was supposed to deroast. They grabbed somebody. Bill Groves interrogated the guy. There were two guys that were just kind of diddy bopping down the trail, like they're on the way to Disney World or something, and they got him. And I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened to that prisoner. Maybe he didn't make it back. I don't know.
Well, a lot of the guys I talked to, and I was reading Dick Thompson's book a couple of weeks ago. They go to all the effort. They get this guy, and he's wounded, and they're trying to keep him alive. And sometimes they either get in a firefight, or the guy bleeds out and he doesn't make it back. So you get a quick field interrogation, but to bring a guy back and have the medics patch him up to live long enough to go to the intel guys, didn't always happen that way,
Yeah.
And that's quite the Dick Meadows. I mean, I think didn't he end up getting like 14 or a dozen?
13 or 14, by different counts, over a good stretch of time. But he was one of the premier prisoners.
Yeah.
As I'm gonna show some photos of him getting the medal, but how do you? I don't want to get too deep into it, but are you covering all of Mr. Bob's career here? Are we covering post-Vietnam, Korea, any of his trips to Afghanistan? What all do you get into, if you don't mind?
The majority of it is his Vietnam experience, and then going back, and he's still at CCC for a long period of time before they pull him out and take him back, saying, "You're going to the White House," and it's not really something he wants to do. He's kind of like Wilson Hunt. He's humble. He's like, "I don't need any medals." And there's a long story of getting there, and Westmoreland, and getting to meet Nixon, and the family being there, and his daughters and his aunt and his wife being there, and then going to see. There's a picture of him and all of his family that day, standing before the eternal flame near Kennedy's grave there. He wanted to go see the tomb of the unknown soldier, and he's telling his daughters about that. And I'd never seen that photo of him standing there at attention, looking at the flame with his daughters and his aunt and his wife.
Wow.
And we do cover a little bit, or I cover a little bit, Korea and some of the other work. It's not as extensive as Vietnam, but we go through a couple chapters of his early childhood, and Grandma Callie, who kind of helped raise him. His father wasn't a good role model. His father was an alcoholic. It's not really a secret. His daughter went through extensively everything I've written and blessed what's in there and the stories that are told. But Grandma Callie would help raise him. And as a boy, Bob was picked on, and he was,
Yeah.
they weren't well-to-do people in Alabama growing up there, and he'd end up having to run home to escape these bullies. And he gets back breathless one day, and Granny Callie steps out and is like, "Robert, boy, what are you doing? What's going on?" And he starts stammering about the bullies and all that. And she has a line that basically says, "You go back next time and you face them. You face things head on. You don't run from your danger. You don't run from trouble." "Yes, ma'am." And so the next day he goes back and he faces the bullies head on, and he comes back beat up and scuffed up and all that, but he points to his feet and he's still got those shoes on. So
Wow. Got
mission accomplished.
goosebumps with that. That's a story right there. Wow.
She was a Bible toting woman, taught him how to read out of the Bible and tried to instill good morals in him, and him and his sisters and brothers, big family, and two of them end up going in the army, he and one of his brothers. But what she taught him is to always face your danger head on, and don't run from it. And that kind of became his mantra, especially in Vietnam, was if it was a machine gun nest or a down chopper with, it's burning and people are in there alive, you don't run from it, you run toward it and either save people or kill people to get other people out of the mission that they're in.
Accomplish that,
So there's a lot of stories about that, as many as I could capture at this late date.
What a strong woman to forge a man like that. I mean, jeez Louise. I mean, and he took that to heart. It like you said. I mean, holy cow.
Yeah, very appreciative of Missy and Frank and the family opening up and sharing some of the scrapbooks and the papers. And
Absolutely.
even Frank has spent years trying to track down all the Purple Hearts and some of the papers. They're just gone. I mean, some of the stuff was destroyed in crashes. Some were probably put in a vault that we'll never see somewhere in the Pentagon.
Hmm.
Some consumed in fires and in different places, and some probably just destroyed as part of the SOG process. There's a photo there that was taken. Yeah, a lot of guys. I name all the names in the book there, but I believe John St. Martin took that photo, and John sent me a copy of that. And some of their buddies. This is after he's kind of on stand down, but he's still training people after the Medal of Honor mission. So all
I've
their
I've got, and I literally, when I saw Mr. Dave Kirschbaum right here with his mustache still and his hat that literally fell apart on his head one afternoon, uh, it made me remember that he has got it may be this same day because it looks like they're in the field outside the wire at FOB2. Mr. Bob is doing ladder, not ladder. He's doing rappelling from the helicopter training, and they're all color
yes,
photo. I don't know if you've seen them, but if you haven't, I will get those to you. They
yeah.
are
If you got any unique Bob Howard photos, I'd love to see them. May or may not be too late to get a few in there, but somewhere down the road, there's always a reprint. And I kind of
yeah.
hope somebody that knew Bob and had some really good stories might want to share. I tried to track down as many as I could, and 10 years ago would have been easier.
Mm,
Like even our relative Wilson Hunt, he's still with us, but he's not the same. He's
mm.
not in great health these days, and that's the same with a lot of these guys that are in their 80s now.
They're the WW2 vets now. Like we looked at them 10, 15 years ago.
Mhm.
They're all getting up there. You'll get lucky. We've got a few of the guys that were 8, 19, 20 years old that are 74, 75, and that's about as young as you're going to get with the SAW guys.
It's kind of getting to where I was 20 years ago with World War II. You had a
Uh,
lot of guys you could track down, and I did a submarine book this past year, and that fellow's still living, and he's going to turn 100 in September. And
Holy
if you saw him, you'd think he was 75. He does not look his age, but we've done some book signings together and done talks at the Nimitz World War II Museum, the Pacific War Museum, and he's so bright. He remembers everything. You know, it's
that's 100 years old, and there he is, not only looking good, but mentally still well enough to help you and keep you straight on WW2 history. That's outstanding. If we could only all be like that, that's amazing. I know we've gone or about an hour and a half here. I know we've gone a little bit over on our time here. there are a few questions, nothing too major. Everybody said they've been glued in, just wanting to listen to y'all. Is there anything else that you guys would like to separately speak about or mention before we hit the few questions before we close out?
I'd just say if you want to get together, first week of December when the Bob Howard book comes out, we could tell a few more of his stories, and who knows, maybe even a guy or two that served with him might jump on with us. But
That would be
there's a lot
fantastic.
to tell. Bob's got a lot of projects he's worked on that deserve equal credit. Some of the notebooks he's put together with all the aviators. Bob and Joe helped me out with quite a bit on my research from what they'd compiled. So, hats
He's
off to people like Bob that have done this kind of work.
Absolutely. He's been helping me literally from the moment we met. I can't speak highly enough of Mr. Bob for not only what he does for me, but for everyone by helping with these books and writing and doing what he does. Mr. Bob, anything you'd like to share with us before we?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, again, reiterate, working with Joe over the years, it's, kind of changed the whole direction of things for me, because I had no idea, but not being a Vietnam participant, somebody said, I'm a retrospective witness. So I said, okay, I'll go with that. So, but
that's a fancy title.
Yeah. Well, she was a Vietnamese person, actually, so she came up with it. Yeah, it's it's kind of amazing as I look back on it, and all the people I've met, Tony Love and Lou, and especially through Joe. I can't say enough about how working with Joe has we just kind of hit it off and working on the books together. He's got so much stuff still in his house that he doesn't. He was going to organize it. Everything. Most people are sending their stuff to Texas Tech University now. It's the largest Vietnam War archive. They actually wanted to be the SOA archive. They said, well, we would be happy to be the official SOA archive. I presented that to Dennis Cummings one time. I said, yeah, Texas Tech. And he said, no, we got our own deal. So supposedly there's some underground bunkers or something with all the SOA stuff. They didn't want to.
Thank God.
Yeah, Joe and I have a small collection there. Frank Greco, I know, just sent him a bunch more stuff. So,
wow.
Joe, he hasn't got it together to organize he's got a whole wall of these binders and books and pictures and things. So, I keep bugging him to get it organized, but he and his stepson Kyle and I'll probably deal with that at some point. And I've got a lot of stuff too. I've given a little bit to Texas Tech, so we already have a Dumont partner archive at Texas Tech, so we're going to give them more stuff. So.
Wow.
Okay. If you go online to Texas Tech to their Vietnam War archive, and I know Frank Greco recently told me he sent him a bunch of stuff, and they gave him a choice of either preserving it digitally or in original format, and he said just keep it in the original format. That was his choice too. So, but there's a lot of we used it for a lot of stuff for the books, but they're kind of behind on their art cataloging. They got so much stuff. But, but anyway, yeah, just working with Joe over the years and getting to know people like Lou DeSetta's a great guy. I talked to him not too long ago, and I got to meet Tony Love in person a few times in California. We had met for coffee. He lives in Northern California. My daughter was in school there for a while, so we'd meet up, and he's told me a lot of interesting things. That he said, "Don't tell Joe this, or don't tell George this," but they probably tell Bud. But and I don't know if you've seen Tony Love's interviews with Bud. They're pretty interesting. Yeah.
They are. They absolutely are. We love Mr. Tony.
And that picture that's in George and Tony that I took when Tony came to SOAR in whatever year it was. And I told Wilson, I said, oh, Tony Love's going to be there. And he was like really looking forward to that. So, I got the picture of the two of them. So that, for me, I'm just say kind of a fly on the wall almost, listening to these guys and hearing all these names, and got to see them over the years. So
that's amazing.
Quite an experience. So
yeah,
Tony Love was always one of the guys that Wilson talked highly about, for sure.
What's that?
Tony Love was always one of the guys that Wilson talked highly
about. Oh yeah,
he
always said he said, I don't know why Tony went on that mission with me. I thought we're all going to get killed. I asked Tony. He said, so we get killed. So,
he's
that's Tony.
Yeah, I was about to say he's one of those guys. Absolutely, he's one of those guys. We've got a few questions. Some of them I think are a little too into the book that might get a little spoily. So we've got just a few since we're already at an hour and a half here, and we'll jump off.
As long as my voice holds out,
it
on these lozenges for the whole evening here. I told my wife to get me a bunch of these lozenges because I knew I had to talk tonight.
I guess for both of y'all, when doing research on Bob Howard, what shocked you the most? The more I read on him, the more I find myself unsurprised after getting a better understanding of who he was. With that, did anything jump out for you?
The understood part was even talking to Wilson Hunt back in the day, on his missions, just the respect everybody had for Howard. Didn't really meet too many people that didn't think highly of him. There's all kind of stories that went on. There's some that'll never be told because the guys aren't with us anymore on that. But he handled adversity. Even like Mike Shepard telling that story that it's in the book of, him taking out another guy. There was a particular confrontation, and there was gunfire, all kind of stuff goes on. But Howard stood up to people, and sometimes, could have cost him his career the way he handled it. Firing live rounds over people's heads during training, and just doing all kind of crazy stuff, making them run down the road outside of FOB, and until eventually he started having to run with a semi-automatic or some kind of weapon with him because they were getting pot shots. The guys just had the utmost respect because he didn't care what it was. He's going right at it, and he's going to take care of it. And in some cases, he had one episode, post Vietnam, where it could have been career ending, where he, used his hand on somebody, and we touch on that lightly, but it was dismissed, it was let go, but that was just his nature. His daughter told a story about running with the company. She was a runner. Missy liked to run, and Bob always ran, and he'd run the guys hard.
Oh, yeah.
And one guy kind of didn't follow Mr. Howard's directions, at that time. And it kind of made it to his daughter and made it to Howard's attention. And he kept that guy behind, and they ran another 20 odd miles, just the two of them, until that guy was puking his guts up. And he kind of learned his lesson, and Howard didn't have to raise his voice or strike him or whatever, but he pretty much ran the guy half to death to prove his point of, when I ask you to do something, this is the way it's going to go. Understood? And he had a way of getting his point across to people, sometimes on unorthodox ways, but he made his point.
I was going to say, even though it's hard to find, but even the guys that didn't like him, they still absolutely respected and revered the man. I've heard that from literally every CCC, FOB2, Task Force 2 man that I've spoken to, that he was revered.
Yeah, it's probably hard to find anybody that's universally loved by everybody that served in any particular conflict, and
especially the military of all places.
Exactly. I mean, somebody got rubbed the wrong way, or their version of the mission doesn't jive with somebody else's version. And so, to the best that I was able, you try to get a second source or a third source where you can to see if the facts or what somebody else says, this is the way that mission went down. So you do the best you can. I know Bob and Joe have done that with all their books to make it as accurate as possible. And if somebody calls it out later, then let's go back and correct it if we can,
Absolutely. Mr. Bob, do you have anything SOG wise or working with Mr. Joe to and learning about any of SOG men that jumped out at you? Same question. Let me pull that up so you can see that. any of your research? Did anything shock you or jump out about the men or the men you were writing about?
I kind of, once I got into what it was all about, then yeah, I just I can't say anything really shocked me too much once I
After that initial blow,
involved in SOG world. Yeah, after I found out what it was all about, and then I said, "Oh, okay, I know I'm in another universe here, so I just take it as it comes." And so
I think
being able to meet a lot of these guys and hear them, at SOAR, listen, just hear them sit around talking and stuff, and
I think one of the
I don't.
interesting things I picked up was the respect Howard had for his men, whether it was trying to go in on a bright light where he was not allowed to go across the fence anymore. But John St. Martin shared a story. He and Ed Wolkoff, been on some missions, and St. Martin was, badly shot up, and Ed helped get him out and all that. But Howard remembered when he was laying there wounded with the gunshot, wound to his face back in '66, and this colonel coming in and checking on his men and seeing how his SOG guys were. So when John St. Martin first gets to FOB2, that's when the Howard, bright light mission is going down, where he's earning the Medal of Honor, and he comes back beat up and shot up, and the whole place, everybody's listening to the radio, tracking this whole mission through the day. And so that was kind of poignant. It's like my first day in, Howard's getting shot up and beat up and all that. And his last day there, when St. Martin is beat up and he's being medevaced out, and Ed Wolkoff and them are trying to save his life, he's in the field hospital, and Howard, flies out there and comes to visit John while he's laying there, recovering from all his severe wounds. And he said that stuck with him. He just kind of held my hand, and he was just letting me know that I was important to him, and he was checking on one of his men that was downed. So it's like my first day in, I'm with Howard. My last day out, Howard comes to see me. So that was a pretty cool story.
Wow. Well, that just speaks to the man right there. I mean, just plain and simple. Some of these other questions are getting a little too into the book. I really hate to ruin it. And as y'all has heard, Mr. Steve said he'll come back when the book is out and we can really dive deep. So I think we'll hold off. I've just saved those, and I'll put those back for when you guys join us again when that's out. Would y'all like to say anything else before we close for the evening?
I'd just say, thanks for having us, Bud. It's an honor. I obviously didn't serve with these guys, but I appreciate them sharing some stories, and I hope in some small way that some of what they did, other people can read this and appreciate.
Absolutely.
Guys that didn't necessarily come home to get a lot of appreciation initially, but with John Plaster's book and with all these guys that have done books since then, and people like Jason Hardy and Steve Sherman and Bob Dumont and Joe Parner, and thank God that some of their stories are getting out there while these guys are still with us.
Absolutely. Mr. Bob,
The only thing I would add is when Joe and I sign books, Joe puts De Oppresso Liber, and I usually put something like, "It's an honor and a pleasure to gotten to know Joe and to work on the books with him." So that's kind of sums up the way I felt about how this has all evolved over the years and a couple of decades now. So, and I don't think Joe's going to make it to SOAR this year, but I'm still thinking about it. How about you, Steve? Are you going to come to SOAR this year, or are you going to wait till?
Kind of depends on the day job and what's going on in October, but we'll see.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And Bud, you said you're going to be there this year, right?
I am. As far as right now, I am set to be there.
Okay.
Very good.
I want to thank y'all both for joining us, and I also want to thank both of you for putting in all the labor y'all have done these past 10, 15 years, because without you two gentlemen, us younger generation would have no idea about these men. We wouldn't have any idea or learn about them to continue on their legacy and preserve their legacies, much like y'all are doing. So I would like to thank y'all personally for doing what y'all have done for the SOG families, the SOG men, and also all of us that are trying to learn about these men. So I would just like to thank you both for all the work y'all have done.
Well, thank you, Bud. I mean, you're doing great stuff too. I mean, it's, you're bringing it into the, up to date here. So, and you're not the only one,
Nope,
working in this field, I know, but I've enjoyed any number of your hearing from the people you talk to. And so I've seen a lot of your bedroom there and your posters on the wall there. And so
most of the guests, I have to admit, as I said, it's my favorite book for a reason, because I've probably read it. I can't even count how many times, but I've also used it for numerous interviews, and Mr. Joe's book and SOG Contum with Tony Love and countless Mr. Terry Cadenback who have been with us. I mean, y'all literally help us out every week with what y'all have done. So thank y'all.
What you're doing. It's important.
Y'all should be proud.
Yeah.
Get those videos. Keep capturing those stories.
Absolutely. We're doing all we can, and we're gonna keep doing it until we finally start getting no's and stop calling me. So we're gonna shut her down for tonight. I want to thank y'all for staying almost 2 hours. I did not intend to keep y'all that long, but everyone appreciates it, including me. And I will be in touch with you guys, and I hope y'all have a pleasant evening.
Thanks, Bud. Take care.
All right, everybody. Y'all have a good evening. See y'all.
Good night.